Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. My name is Joseph Cronin. I'm the director of the Leo Beck Institute, London, and this evening I'm delighted that we are hosting a lecture in collaboration with the Institute of Languages, Cultures and Societies at the University of London. I hope this is the first of many collaborations. Before starting, I've been asked to read out this disclaimer. As this talk is being recorded, may we remind our online audience over there to keep their cameras turned off and microphones on use during the actual lecture. During the discussion, please feel free to turn your cameras back on unless you prefer your image not to be captured on the recording. So, it is my pleasure to introduce Godela Weiss-Sussex, who is Professor of Modern German Literature at the Institute of Languages, Cultures and Societies at the School of Advanced Study, University of London. Her research explores 20th and 21st century culture and literature with a particular focus on women's writing and German Jewish literature, both within Germany and in exile. Professor Weiss-Sussex has published widely on these topics. A couple of recent examples include the volume Contested Communities, Minor, Minority and Small Literatures in Europe, co-edited with Kate Averis and Margaret Littler and published in 2023, and a collection on the German Jewish novelist Barbara Honigmann, co-edited with Robert Gillett and published in 2023. Professor Weiss-Sussex's monograph, Jüdin und Moderne, Jewish Women and the Modern, published in 2016, was a path-breaking study of the literary world of German Jewish women writers in Berlin in the early 20th century. But tonight, Professor Weiss-Sussex is going to talk about the manuscript of a novel she was handed in a bag of unsorted papers at a conference. I shall say no more. Please join me in welcoming Professor Godela Weiss-Sussex.
Well, thank you so much for the kind invitation and for the opportunity to talk about this book. Because this is really what I want to do this evening. I want to talk about the book. I want to tell you the story of how it came about that this novel, which was believed lost, has now been published some 8 decades after it was written. And I want to give you a little insight into the text, a little taster of Hermann's writing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the English translations of German originals in my talk, but the German original will, if I can work it out, appear on the PowerPoint. Okay, firstly, who was Georg Hermann? His real name was Georg Borchert, and he was born in 1871 into a German Jewish family in Berlin. He worked as an art critic for the papers of the Wallstein publishing house, but also way beyond that for some 40-odd papers all across Germany, mainly as art critic, but also as political commentator and essayist. He was also starting to publish literary text. His first novel, entitled Spielkinder, came out in 1896. But then in 1906, he wrote the novel. He published the novel that made him famous, Jättchengebet, which was then followed by a sequel, Henriette Jacobi, in 1908. The Jättchen novels Some of you may know them. The Jäckchen novels are historical novels. They are set in Biedermeier, Berlin, so 1820s. And they give a wonderful insight into the cultural landscape, the city life, and also the atmospheric density of Berlin in the 1820s. He had extremely well prepared for this. He also published an edited volume with texts on the Biedermeier culture. So he was really steeped into the material. Hermann's gently humorous and always slightly melancholy voice made a big impact and made him stand out. And so he quickly was established as one of the most popular Berlin novelists of the early 20th century. Indeed, in the words of a contemporary critic, Hermann's work was soon regarded as der Ausdruck, the expression of the city of Berlin. But well beyond the local connection to Berlin, Hermann also became highly respected as a novelist with a finger on the pulse of contemporary life, as an author of essays and political observations, whose pacifism alienated some, but also earned him the respect of others. In March 1933, Hermann was forced into exile. He chose the Netherlands and settled first in Laren, and then 1 year later moved on to Hilversum. From here, he was able to publish 3 more novels, one with Alette Lange and 2 with Menno Herzberger, the last of which was Der Etruskische Spiegel, The Etruscan Mirror, which was published in 1936. After that, opportunities for publishing dried up. And yet, from letters to his daughters, Hilda and Eva, which were written in the autumn 1939, 1940, and published later by Loring Nussbaum, we knew that Hermann had begun working on a substantial 4-part novel. On the 10th of October, 1939, Hermann wrote to Hilda, "I am working on something important, something that needs to be written so that it exists." And just a few weeks later, in late November, Hermann mentions the title of the planned text, Die Daheim Blieben, those who stayed at home or those who stayed behind. He reports that he's been working on it mit wilder Energie, with wild energy, and that he has managed to complete the first 2 parts. He assures Hilde that his writing is allerbester Georg Hermann, very best Georg Hermann. So time and again, Hermann researchers have voiced their frustration and their regret that this work, which, so Hermann explained, described the fate of the Jews in Germany, that this work should not have survived. But on the other hand, this was considered almost inevitable, seeing the vagaries of the 1940s and beyond. The only section that we thought had survived the war was a 36-page manuscript, the beginning of part 3, which is held in the Leo Baeck Institute in New York. And it's accessible online. You can see the manuscript there. So sadly, the rest of the work had to be considered lost. However, in September 2001, I organized a conference on Hermann's work at the then Institute of Germanic Studies, together with the Leo Baeck Institute. The conference was a very modest undertaking, which drew only a small circle of researchers, and most were known to one another. So it was surprising that there were 2 attendees whom neither I nor anyone else had ever met before. And they introduced themselves as George Rothschild and John Craig Sharples, Hermann's grandson and great-grandson. They attended the event, and at the end they handed me a bag containing many papers, many pages of densely typed text, and reams of paper covered in notes. And they asked me to look through these papers to see whether they were of interest and perhaps might be published. Now, you can imagine what a moment that was. You know, it's really the dream that any researcher has, I think. And even if at first I didn't quite realize how important these papers were, I was absolutely convinced I wanted to look into this. And indeed, the papers included the complete typescripts of the first two parts of Die Daheim Blieben. So those two parts that Hermann had mentioned in his letter to Hilde. The typescripts are a total of 219 densely typed pages with handwritten annotations and many notes, and all of this on very fragile paper, but mostly perfectly readable. So I've just given you an example here of, you can see how tightly typed it is. He's really used every space that he had. And then he has these insertions in there, which, you know, are very neat and very readable. So, you know, this looks like plain sailing. It gets more difficult later on. Okay, so how had these papers survived the war? How was it possible to preserve these fragile sheets through all the upheaval and the relocations of exile? It was possible because Hermann's family was very aware of the importance of these papers and went to great lengths to save them. Hermann did not live alone in his exile in Hilversum. He shared his home with his youngest daughter Ursula and her baby son. And it was Ursula who ensured that at least parts of Hermann's art collection, as well as a considerable amount of his papers, were saved. In an interview with George Rothschild in 1998, Ursula looked back on the expulsion of the small family from their home in Hilversum in January 1943. She recalls that the German officer who came to give them the order to move to Amsterdam gave the family 48 hours to prepare for the move. She explains, "I recall that during that 48-hour period, I used the baby stroller in the evening and made trips to take some things to Elsie, a friend, and to other people in order to hide them. I already understood that I had to do this, otherwise all would have been lost." So the little family then moved to Amsterdam in January 1943, and then in June, Hermann was transferred to the Dutch transit camp Westerbork and finally deported to Auschwitz on the 16th of November, where he died shortly after his arrival. After the war, Hermann's eldest daughter Eva traveled to the Netherlands, collected the remaining estate, and brought it to England, where she now lived with her family. In the 1970s then, she donated a huge box of Hermann's papers to the Leo Baeck Institute, as the then director Arnold Pauker recalls. And these papers included a number of unpublished works from the exiled years. Many of them are still unpublished, but not the typescripts of this last unfinished novel. These, together with some other papers, remained in the hands of Eva and then her son, George Rothschild. So, strictly speaking, they were never lost. They were very well looked after. And I'm hugely grateful to George and to his nephew John for making them accessible so that they could now be published. And many thanks to John and George, who are here in the audience as well. So, so what kind of book is Die Daheim Blieben? As Hermann indicated in his letter to Hilde of late November 1939, it is a family novel. It was planned to consist of 4 parts, each of them offering a momentbild, a momentary glimpse, a snapshot, to reflect the family's reactions to a particularly incisive historical event. So the first part, Max und Dolly, is set in Berlin on a Sunday morning in March 1933, so shortly after Hitler's rise to power. This is then followed by Ilse und Lise, also set in Berlin, on the afternoon and evening of the 15th of September 1935, which is the day the Nuremberg race laws were passed at the Nazi Party Congress. The other planned but unfinished, respectively unwritten parts were to be Georg der Doctor, set in Florence in September 1938, and capturing the atmosphere among German exiles after Mussolini's declaration of the Italian race laws. And finally, Heinrich and Agnes, and this concluding part was going to reflect the events of the pogrom night of the 9th of November, 1938, and it was to end the narrative with the death of the oldest family members, the ones who had stayed behind in Berlin. Each of the four parts stands alone. The focus is on capturing the here and now of the snapshot, the Momentbild. And yet, read together as a whole, they are a sequence and they are a coherent whole, a family chronicle of the years 1933 to 1938. So let's go a little further into detail. Max and Dolly, the first part, depicts a large, boisterous family gathering. The Simon family celebrates 3 occasions at once. The 75th anniversary of the family firm, Heinrich Simon Söhne, Papier en gros, Heinrich's 69th birthday, and Heinrich and Agnes's 40th wedding anniversary. The events are focused on a single day and a single place, the few meters in front of and inside Heinrich and Agnes's flat in the Mathie-Kirchstraße in Tiergarten in Berlin. The beginning of the text displays a tried and tested technique of Hermann's writing. He unfolds his novel's setting through an almost cinematic zooming in process. We start with a lavish and very ironic description of early spring in Berlin, and then gradually the focus narrows down and swoops in until we find ourselves at the front door of Heinrich and Agnes's building. Throughout these opening pages, the narrator's tone is light, humorous, ironic. He refuses to take seriously the SA men marching in heroic step. And they sang songs full of heroic spirit, we are told. For the German man may not be able to sing, but he does it anyway, loudly and vigorously and with pleasure, because it prevents him from thinking. The same care that we find in Hermann's depiction of cityscape and milieu, he also applies to the introduction of his protagonists, very much following the narrative conventions of his favorite author, Theodor Fontane. He succinctly characterizes the family members through their own speech in conversation. So I want to introduce you to the principal cast. First, there are the 3 brothers of the older generation. Heinrich, director of the family firm, who relies on experience and continuity and intends to sit out the Nazi rule, just as he did the other crises of recent years. J'y suis, j'y reste, only with the last train. There is Arthur, professor of medicine and hospital director, who's certain of his status and ignores the danger. Ah, well, I don't think we need to be afraid here. And Martin, the melancholic art collector, who implores his brothers with desperate urgency to leave the country. Get out, 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 he advises Heinrich. Among the younger members of the family, the range of positions is even greater. There is Max, who arrives in his luminous green and yellow speckled racing car, who appears to take nothing seriously, but has no illusions about the danger he's in as a communist and also as a suspect to have been involved in the Reichstag fire. There's Dolly, who's considering joining the Russian communist experiment, and there's Lotte, who forcefully warns against the anti-Semitic tendencies of communism. There is Georg, an intellectual, highly gifted and useless, who has been living in Florence for 10 years and has come to terms with Italian fascism. And one young offspring of the family, poor little Arnold, a rather simple soul, has even turned to Orthodox Judaism, to the consternation of the rest of the clan. And repeatedly, we hear the voices of those who claim, die Dinge werden nie so heiß gegessen, wie sie gekocht werden. Things are never as bad as they seem. In its diversity, this family cannot be described with a metaphor of a Stamm or a family tree. Rather, as Hermann explains, it was far more like a wall of leaves, eine Laubwand. The range of reactions to the impending danger is impressive, and that's really what this first part is about. The plot is clearly secondary. What really matters is the dialogue, the conversations between the family members as they debate the current situation across generations and across political convictions, as they question their identity as Germans and as Jews, and as they weigh options and possibilities for their future in Germany or in exile. The questions debated here are the same that Hermann considers in his essays from this period, and I'm just giving you a few titles there of some are published, some are unpublished. Yet for all the polyphony, Hermann keeps a firm grip on his narrative. He closely controls the prevailing tone. In the narrator's commentary, but also in the voices of the melancholic Martin and on the young communist Max as well, we recognize Hermann's own positions. But above all, we are Europeans in the broadest sense and want to remain so, for instance. And the declaration that Jewishness is a mentality and not a record in the laying of tefillin. These are examples of statements we know from Hermann's essay texts. It is clear, for Hermann, Zionism is not a way out, but clinging to Germanness is no longer an alternative either. Max and Dolly ends with a brief epilogue the following day, which rounds off and really closes, very, very skillfully, closes this framework and shapes the first part of the novel into a whole in its own, an independent, self-contained text. What appeared carefree and light-hearted at the beginning is taken up again with a serious, even existential twist at the end. The SA men, for instance, who are ridiculed at the beginning of the text, prove to be a life-threatening peril, as Heinrich's brother Arthur is brutally removed from his hospital and severely injured in the process. And Max's racing car, the green and yellow luxury vehicle, first introduced as an emblem of joyous jauntiness, turns sprayed black and with a changed license plate into the getaway car that saves Max's life. So it is a standalone text, but in terms of the novel project as a whole, this first part provides the starting point. It sets the scene. It raises the central questions that pervade the rest of the work. The second part, Ilse und Lise, uses this starting point and jumps ahead to September 1935, focusing on the changes that have occurred in the intervening 2.5 years. Over the first 30 pages or so, a long introductory section, we accompany Heinrich Simon on a walk through the streets of Berlin. Hermann presents a picture of life under Nazi rule in short, precisely captured vignettes. It is so immediate. It's really, it's very moving to read. It is the little observations of everyday life that he excels at. The gawping people in front of a Nazi newspaper display, casual harassment by Gestapo and SA, the kiosk owner who smuggles banned foreign press to his long-standing customers, and everyone's constant fear of informers. Eventually, we find ourselves back in the flat in Mattei-Kirchstraße. Here, Hermann now mirrors the family celebration from Max and Dolly, but the same rooms that had been so full of people then, full of opinions and considerations of possibilities, are now eerily empty and quiet. Whereas the gathering in March 1933 of the more intimate circle of the family had filled 6 rooms with children, friends, etc., now only Agnes and Heinrich themselves, their daughter Ilse, and 4 other guests are present. These are the Simon family members who have remained in Berlin. The rest have largely emigrated abroad. The reason for the gathering also contrasts with that of the first part. This is not a celebration. This is a visit of condolence, as Heinrich's brother Arthur has died in American exile. The shrunk premises and the painfully diminished family present, as well as the conversations about the daily intimidations, arrests, and the growing precarity of livelihoods, reflect the changes since March 1933. Resignation is in the air, and fear and worry determine the underlying mood. When the two old people finally sit alone in their flat, Hermann introduces a rather unexpected motif into his narrative. Agnes lights the Jahrzeitlampe, the seasonal light, which in Jewish custom symbolizes the soul of the deceased and is kept burning during the whole period of mourning, so during the 1 week of mourning. So once again, we realize that how much times have changed and the attitudes that this assimilated Jewish family has always proudly upheld need to be reconsidered. Even if wearing the kippah, eating kosher food, and learning Hebrew had always seemed alien to them, Hermann now emphasizes the consolation that lies in this Jewish rite of mourning, and that sets a sign of unity for the family in the face of the, I quote, uncertainty of life that had befallen them. So taking these two parts of Die Daheim Blieben together, we see a structural movement of fanning out and reining back in, retreating, as the possibilities for action are first presented in all their breadth and then withdrawn as hopes fade and the family drifts apart. Self-reflection, the voice of the melancholic observer Heinrich Simon, now largely replaces the lively polyphonic discussion of the opening text. And those of you who've seen Tom Stoppard's play Leopoldstadt will recognize this structure, this boisterous, huge, family filling the whole stage, and then second act, this diminished. And of course, on stage, it's even more impressive, more immediately visible, but it's a very moving structural device. For the third part of the novel, entitled Georg der Doktor, the setting jumps to Florence, but despite the exotic location, this part was clearly conceived as integral part of Die Daheim Blieben. In the first 36 pages of the typescript that survive, we recognize the same structural principles that we saw in the novel's first two parts. Hermann's narrator starts with very broad evocations of Italian culture, Italian landscapes and art and lifestyle. In fact, to me, it's really extraordinary. I picture Hermann sitting in his cold, wintry exile in Hilversum and then conjuring up this warm, sunny, amazing, cultured, civilized world. He does so with vivacity, warmth, and colorfulness. And not for nothing, he's repeatedly been described as the eidetiker par excellence, so an author who captures visual impressions like few others. The narrator extols the virtues of Florence as a place of exile, of true civilization. However, the seeming calm and sense of refuge that is evoked here, and the belief that anti-Semitism played no role in Italian fascism, is revealed as self-deception when Mussolini's race laws are published in 1938. And suddenly, on a wondrously glorious September day, the time had come, and the decrees were there, were in the newspapers, were on the hoardings, were posted in the signoria in front of the little Baroque fountain, and in all police stations. The timeless beauty of nature and culture and the inhumane present are shockingly juxtaposed and very, very abruptly juxtaposed in Hermann's description. The anti-Semitic decrees are perceived as betrayal by the German immigrants, and betrayal hurts more than anything else. Georg, the title character of this third part, does not appear in the surviving typescripts, nor is there much indication of the planned plot. The many scattered notes in George Rothschild's possession that were meant to find their way into the text present a puzzle that we can't really solve. But even if the relationship of all these fragments and notes to one another are less than clear, it is worth pausing over one or the other affectionate vignette of life in Florence. Here, for instance, a note that conveys a touching image. So if you look at, oh gosh, this is too small, isn't it? If you look at the middle part here, I'll just read that out. Georg the doctor took out a sheet of paper, wrote Greece on it in large letters, laid it on the floor and placed the large Greek tortoise next to it on the tiles that had been warmed by the sun, whose slanting beam of light fell through the open window into the long, somewhat bare room, so that it might feel at home in spite of everything. The final part, entitled Heinrich and Agnes, was to be set in Berlin on the day and night of the pogrom of the 9th of November 1938. It was to focus on the two old people, the only family members left behind, and it was meant to highlight das hilflose Ausgeliefertsein, the helpless vulnerability of the old couple. As we know from Hermann's letters, he envisaged a highly emotional ending. Having witnessed the brutal destruction of Jewish livelihoods in Berlin, Heinrich dies of heart failure and Agnes takes her own life. Shortly after the couple's death, a message from their daughter Ilse was to arrive from the United States, and in a letter to Hilde, Hermann outlined his plan as follows. The dispatch arrives, ship's berth, first class, cabin number 3738, paid here. See you soon, Ilse. As in Hermann's previous exile novel, Der Etruskische Spiegel, the message received too late, which would have prevented the tragic death, concludes the text, or was to conclude the text, because this remained Hermann's plan. He was not able to put this last part of Die Daheim Blieben on paper. Only a collection of typewritten notes has been preserved. But Heinrich and Agnes was crucial to the project, perhaps even its starting point. It's not only the title, Die Daheim Blieben, that points to this. Among Hermann's notes, I also found the following dedication to his daughter Eva. You once said the fate of the old people who stayed behind in Germany in the end, all alone, must now remain unwritten. For among the many hundreds of thousands of tragedies of Jewish people from Germany and in Germany, although no one actually pays attention to them, this would be the worst in its hopelessness. I, you say, might well be suited to try my hand at it. You see that I have tried. With 1,000 greetings, your father. This dedication reiterates one of Hermann's driving concerns throughout his life. Already in his foreword to Jettchen Gebert, so already in 1906, he had stated that he writes to bear witness to life, vom Leben Zeugnis zu geben. This concern to bear witness, to give others a voice, to make them heard, is also at the root of Hermann's last exile novel. And it's not just the continuity of the motivation, of Hermann's motivation for writing that I find striking, but also the extent to which he remained faithful to his aesthetic program over the years. This final novel once more displays Hermann's characteristic writing style, a style he himself described as soulful impressionism. He still captures political reality, visual detail, and atmospheric intensity like few other authors. He still relies on the dual strategies of polyphonic conversation and thoughtful introspection, and he still interweaves personal authorial reflection with the novel's narrative in a way that enriches the text but does not overload it. It is these characteristics that are distinctive and that set Hermann's novel apart from those of, say, Leon Feuchtwanger or Gabriele Tergit. These characteristics and the structuring of the text, the momentary acuity and the concentration on key moments, combined with a grand narrative arc, which allows temporality, continuity and change to unfold. So that combination works extremely well. In the concluding part of my talk, I would like to introduce you a little bit to the typescripts and show you what they look like and what we can glean from them in terms of Hermann's working methods. So let's first look at the typescripts of the finished first two parts. As I mentioned earlier, they are made up of a total of 219 pages, written on thin carbon paper in fragile condition, but completely preserved. There are many handwritten corrections, and at times they are quite hard to decipher. So what I'm showing you here is a picture of the third part, Georg der Doctor, set in Florence. And this is a passage where the narrator has just sort of thought about various cities in Italy and is vaguely thinking about, oh, where could one live? Where would be nice to live? And he's forgotten Lucca. So he puts in, what does he put in? He puts in vielleicht Lucca, vielleicht doch nein. Yeah, maybe Lucca, but no. So that's nice and clear. We know he meant this to be, two new paragraphs set below. What is slightly more complex or misleading perhaps is here Einschiebsel aus Seite 6. So here a little insertion from page 6. And this occurs quite often. And if you're lucky, on page 6 there is something that you can find and that actually works. But it really is a puzzle, and I can just say it was hugely enjoyable work to puzzle this out and work out how it all worked. And I must acknowledge help of Jack Ascott, who need help in doing this. Okay, so that's the typescripts, but then there are the notes. So in George Rothschild's collection, there are pages and pages of quotations, individual sentences, short descriptive passages, snippets of dialogue. The sheer quantity of notes indicates how intensely Hermann was steeped in the project. There are all sorts. There are A4 sheets of paper on which completely separate thoughts just follow one after the other. There are postcards, pages torn out of small notebooks, there are scraps and slips and all kinds of formats. And all of this was material for the resulting novel. I'll show you here a picture of the dedication that I mentioned earlier. And what you can see is in the top part here shows you a draft of the dedication. And then he types out a version that he's happy with, outlines it in a pencil, and he's got Widmung up here, so that's the dedication. And what I also want to draw your attention to is these last two lines here. Completely different thought, completely different section there. This is a piece of dialogue, just 2 lines of dialogue, and he writes the dialogue down first, then he allocates it to the characters, Agnes and Ilse, and it did go into the written text. It is in there. Yeah, I want to show you another example. So this is an example where all these completely different thoughts are just separated by a pencil line. And again, we have the thoughts or the quotation or the idea first, and then the allocation to the character. And then it was to go into the novel. So I want to draw your attention to this last, or this one word last section here, allocated to Heinrich. It's a note about a man who was killed because he's said to have shot at a Nazi flag, with a little comment, glaubst du es, seit wann schießt er? Do you believe that? Since when does he shoot? Yeah, so it's part of a dialogue, which, and indeed, in slightly changed form, that also went in. That is in the final part. However, the vast majority of these fragments were not included into Hermann's typescripts of the finished parts of the novel. They just give us an indication of what was to come, had he had more time. Ultimately, the amount of notes and the work of composing, structuring, and fine-tuning this large project required, that this now large project required, proved to be unmanageable for the seriously ill Hermann. When I have even lost the desire to write novels and can't bring myself to start the third part, then I must be in a bad way in every respect. He wrote to Hilde in January 1940. And yet he did start work on Georg der Doctor, the third part, in February 1940. We know this from a postcard he sent to Hilde showing the face of an angry old man, a Japanese mask from the No Theatre, and which he signed Georg der Expatrierte, Georg the Expatriate. In May 1940, the German invasion of the Netherlands began, and in the desperately difficult final years before his death in 1943, Hermann was not able to complete this novel project. Also, despite his best efforts, he was unable to find a publisher for the first two completed parts. With bitterness, he concluded, emigrant literature is rejected here because it is too pessimistic and not uplifting. The chances of publication were no better elsewhere. Hermann repeatedly urged Hilde and Eva to pursue any opportunities that might arise. He mentions various possible avenues and tenuous connections to translators and publishers, in Sweden, for instance, and in London. And the urgency of his request is unmistakable, as he emphatically pressed his daughters to make sure that the first two parts of Die Daheim Blieben should be published für sich und jetzt schon, so by themselves and already now. Don't wait, get them published. And this, I think, may be the reason why, or maybe one reason why the typescripts did not find their way to the Leobeck Institute like the other papers in Hermann's bequest. They may have been kept apart initially because of their urgency as a text that a publisher needed to be found for, and then forgotten or lost in the chaos of the war years. Be that as it may, nothing came of these attempts during Hermann's lifetime. And so I was really delighted when last year Wallstein and the series editor Christian Klein embraced the project and invited me to edit and publish the completed first two parts, as well as the beginning of the third part. I've done this belatedly, of course, but with an acute awareness of the importance of the novel. For Die Daheim Blieben was and is important in three respects. Firstly, for Hermann himself, for whom working on this text meant nothing less than giving meaning and consolation to his life. Looking back, he wrote to Hilde in November 1940, "For me, at least, writing has been the only possible form, because it very precisely feels the pulse of reality, and yet remains so sharply personal that it has helped me to bear my life." Secondly, the novel is important as the missing final point of the author's body of work. It is, to me, a real delight to see how he picks up the narrative structures, the themes, the tone of his earlier works and uses them to convey new content that was highly topical at the time and that has not lost any of its impact today. And thirdly, and most importantly, the novel is an important document of exile literature. Hermann's own assessment of his text was A, good as a novel, and B, incredibly important as a record of the contemporary moment. He is undoubtedly right. Die Daheim Blieben is a deeply moving, politically astute and cleverly constructed literary text. The surviving parts of the novel give us an insight into the lives of the German Jews in the years 1933 to 1938, with a directness and urgency that significantly enriches the previously known corpus of exile literature. The reception of the book has been very positive indeed. There have been reviews on Deutschlandfunk and also in various national and regional papers. The daily paper Die Welt referred to it in their December roundup as one of the best books of 2023. The Berlin daily Der Tagesspiegel devoted almost a full page to it, calling it a Sensationsfund, a sensational find. And in view of the current climate of rising anti-Semitism, das Buch der Stunde, the book of the hour. The reviewer closes with the words, "The fact that Hermann's last work has now been published is cause for celebration. The only sad thing is the circumstances that make it so topical." Many thanks.
I was told to stop sharing the screen. Thank you, Godela, for a really wonderful, powerful, thought-provoking lecture, and I hope there are some good questions. We'll take some from the room first, but if anybody watching online has got questions, I think if you can digitally raise your hand or notify us in some way in the chat. You can also turn your video on now, should you wish to. Let's go first.
Thank you, Gordon. I'm really pleased I could see that. It's brilliant. I was curious, you mentioned that he said he thought that kind of literature in those books was too pessimistic and not uplifting. And I'm wondering, you said that he might have tried to get it published in London, and I'd be really interested to know more, like if you have any idea of which publishers you've spoken to. And I was wondering if you think maybe it wouldn't have been a success in England because of Feuchtwanger had sort of got there first with Die Geschwister, because you said he was different to Feuchtwanger and Turkish, but like for people would have just seen him as an exiled roman, so then they would put him in that bracket. So then how is he different? And sort of, I wondered, just thinking about it from a kind of publishing and translation perspective, why would someone want to publish him, and why didn't they want to publish him?
Gosh, yes, that's a really good question. Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, you know more than I do probably about what was published in those years. But I think it was really just an attempt to hook on to people he knew, he had worked with before, and to see whether, they would publish it again.
So have you published books in English before? Had it had to be translated at all?
No, there was one translation of Jettchen Gebert. But as far as I'm aware, that was an American translation. Anyway, there was one translation into English, but no more than that. So he wasn't well known in England, and I can find out for you who the publishers were, but I don't know yet. Who knows?
Thank you. I have a question which you may not be able to answer, but ask it anyway, and that is the production of the text. Do we know whether Hermann typed or printed, and then made handwritten corrections?
Yeah, he typed. In fact, in his letters to Hilda, there's a passage where he says, he gives her advice as to, how to write, and he says, beware of typing because it flows so quickly. So he did type, and yeah, I mean, some of the notes I showed you, he even he even sort of typed several drafts, and then the finished product, yes, and then just the handwritten insertions later on. Yeah, Johnny.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was so great. I'm wondering, so this novel has been quite well received in Germany, as we can see from the articles and stuff you showed us. Do you expect it to sort of generate renewed interest in his earlier work as well?
So it is it was published in a new series of republications. So I think it will do that. But what I'm also hoping is that I will find a translator. I really want to see this in English. And the other thing I'm thinking, I mean, this is sort of, at the moment, this is very unrealistic, but what I would like to see, I would really like to see this as an adaptation. I can just imagine how well it would work either as film or as a play. And he had that in mind as well. There are passages in his letter where he's saying, this could be a theatre. Yeah.
Thank you, Godela, for I'm interested in the reader's perspective, reading, and we, of course, know a lot more than Hermann, and it's sometimes been argued that this affects if you actually know so much later, does that help to, what effect does that have on a description of the lead up to this? But the fact that was without that, and I have found it quite a difficult read because I keep beating up against every time some comment about what's a very pointless comment, what's going to happen, how to go on. And we who know it affects how you read, I think, as well as hugely intensifying and touching.
Yeah.
I was just wondering what you feel about that tension between historical perspective from which Georg Hermann's writing and our perspective as readers, so much later.
Well,
so
that, yeah.
State of the world now.
Yeah. Yeah.
I fight these.
Yeah.
Also reading, thinking,
I think exactly as you say, it makes it even more poignant, doesn't it? But he is very, he is already very, very aware. I mean, he deliberately builds it up in this sort of faux naive enjoyment of the beautiful Berlin, and then he brings you the contrast, and he is very, very adept and very clever in constructing his writing, and I do think, I completely agree with you. I do think it is just more poignant, this deliberate sort of slowly bleeding us in, this first part where it's still quite flippant at times, but he's writing this in 38. He knows where he's going with this. And yes, it sticks in your throat, doesn't it?
He doesn't quite know what he knows.
No, yeah.
This is what speaks to him.
Yes. Yeah. Well, he knows, up until 39, but yeah. Ellen, did you have another?
I've got loads of questions. I don't want to be really annoying.
Okay.
Shall we take Goldsmith's question from Zoom? Or...
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. So first of all, apologies for not coming. I wish I had now. A small group of us have been reading Feuchtwanger's The Oppermanns online in a book club, and it's fascinating the parallels here. One thing I'm intrigued by is the debate about emigration and the Zionist approach, which you say at the end of what, part one is not seen as a realistic way out. You've got the group who the guy who turns back to Orthodox Judaism. You've got the sort of more American car and the sort of thing as emigration to Europe or America. How much discussion is there about those different options, and how much in the subsequent year, say 1935, do you learn how those options have worked and reflect back on them? Because that's one of the fascinating things to look at for that period, is the different approaches to how to respond to ghastly anti-Semitism and the choice you make depending on your beliefs.
Thank you. Yes. Well, exactly. No, this debate is very much at the heart of the first part. And what is really interesting is how he guides his characters through this. And Heinrich, for instance, really completely poo-poos the whole thing. Yeah, I'm not going to leave. And so he gives you the lines of thought of a whole wide spectrum of possibilities. And then in the second part, we know who's gone where. So he does follow up. In fact, there is a very, very moving bit where one of the daughters of Heinrich, had been separated from her husband, but the husband now has a place on a ship to America, and she seizes the opportunity and goes with him. And then, we follow up, then Heinrich dies in America. So it becomes a family chronicle, and through that lens of the family chronicle, it discusses the possibilities and what then happens to them. But also it discusses what that does to the family. The family, which is reduced at the end to the two old people left behind in Berlin.
So whilst it's fiction, it's also a fascinating primary source for a historian then, trying to look at the debate which was taking place within the Jewish community at that time, which is what I really wanted to research through the prism of my family and other arguments going on around them. Fascinating.
Absolutely.
And Berlin politics is my grandfather comes from. It sounds like I should be reading it immediately. Thank you.
and especially if you read this together with the essays that Hannah was writing.
Right. Yeah.
It's just a different form, but it's the same content. And it's also this very, very immediate description of, I'm going through Berlin, I'm seeing this, I'm hearing this. It feels very, very, very immediate.
So alongside Alfred Wiener's reports back, it's a similar sort of text, really, to understanding what was happening at the time. Fascinating.
Any other questions on Zoom before we move back to the room?
Yes, can you hear me, Martin Swales?
Yes.
I just thank you for the lecture. And thank you for what you did, which was provide the cause for the lecture by bringing out the novel. There's a special achievement, I think, both to be the commentator on it and the making of that text as a published thing. I just wanted to add one reflection. It seems to me that what Hermann does get is both the materiality and the mentality of the Jewish people, the Jewish culture in the 1930s. And that sense of seeing through their eyes the material world, which seems so welcoming and sustaining, but also hearing in their minds the disquiet that this world may play them false, is magnificent. And I wanted just to add one footnote. I love the narration. It's most extraordinary. I don't think I can think of another novel where the narration, largely third person, does go so close and stay so close to the characters, even quoting some of their favorite phrases. Nicht wahr? Na ja, na ja. The narrator is not judgmental, he's implicit and complicit in that materiality and mentality. And that is quite some achievement, I think. And thank you for it.
I absolutely agree. And in fact, I would add another dimension. The narrator then slips into, now and then, says things like, oh, I've said this in my previous novel. So, oh, right, okay. So the narrator is also the author.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So much, that was fascinating. You mentioned that it's so different from Target's work, but I keep thinking how similar it is with themes in Effinger, with the panoply of characters and how they represent the different facets of various debates, and then showcase the people. Could you say a bit more about the differences? Because I would love to hear more. And also, could we group those two novels and others into one genre that has a continuation? Again, family chronicle.
Yeah.
It's really about a moment.
Yeah. I mean, the reason I mentioned Feuchtwanger and Target is because obviously they have so much in common. They are family novels. So they have the breadth and they have the continuity, the temporality. But the difference, I would say, so Target has a very short sort of Telegraphen-style sometimes. You know, she's very close to reality, very close to journalistic writing. She gives you lots and lots of facts, and these things happen. And whereas Hermann covers possibly less ground in terms of years covered, but he gives you the impressionistic intensity. He gives you the momentary. He gives you the beauty also, the beauty of Berlin in spring, you know, in a very, very sort of tactile way. So he gives you more of a narrative context than Target does. But you are, of course, absolutely right that the underlying similarity is the approach to tell this particularly difficult story, to tell it through the family saga as a one. Yeah.
I was struck when I looked at photographic yearbooks and Nazi publications. That there was a strong message sent to amateur photographers to create side documentary. And I wondered to what extent you feel that there's all one world, isn't it? Doing more respond in different ways. Georg and I also discussed this real obsession of non-Jewish Germans after the war to write memoirs. It's also a side documentary. Seems to kind of respond to a sense that this was a really different time, that this was really, they were experiencing history in ways, but that was worth recording everyday life and sort of subjective.
Not just worth recording, but this real, I mean, really that speaks from the letters, you know, this real need, this, you know, we need to remember this. And not only we need to remember it, but also he's writing in 38. We need the world to know. So you already have that, of course, in Feuchtwanger, but you have it again in Hermann. And that is really quite interesting because in his previous novels, I was saying he always was concerned with keeping a record and giving people a voice, but it was his previous novels had not been so directly, you know, documenting a particular lifestyle or period of life. So he's gathering his forces, using his typical style, but using it for a new purpose. That is new, this documentary. Yeah.
Could you say a bit more about his essays, where they were published and where one can read them now?
So the essays of the exile years are on, so those that are in the Leo Baeck Institute are online. The Leo Baeck Institute New York has digitized and put them online. There are quite a few. But there are also some that are not published and that are in the papers that haven't been made available. I think there are sort of attempts to gather all this and publish the exile essays.
Do you know where he published them during that period, or were they not published during that period?
They were not published, as far as I'm aware. Yeah.
Andrew has a question.
Oh.
Okay, fine. Andrew Webber, obviously, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, at first, I'd like to echo what Martin Swales said and to say thank you, Godela, and I'm another person who's had the opportunity to read this, and I would warmly recommend it to everybody present. It is extraordinarily moving, and one of the things that I don't think you did mention about it, which I also find moving, is in the second section, how the condolence visits, which you talked about, actually turn into a kind of decision, a strategy of not imparting the news of the brother's death. So a question of communicability, really. And I suppose, therefore, as you say, the novel itself is so much about giving testimony, but it also includes this scene, which until its end, when the candle is lit, is about not communicating, deciding not to or not being able to communicate. And I think there's something very powerful in that, and something which goes beyond the time of it's partly about that time, but it's also about the aftermath of that time and what can be said.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I didn't mention that it's the so the quote, the sentence that is said several times in that section is, jede Stunde, die sie es nicht wissen, ist doch gewonnen. So every hour they don't know about the death of the brother is an hour won, an hour gained. So it's the reason it's not said is for care of the other. And that is sort of paralleled with two other strands. Heinrich knows about the difficult life decisions that his two daughters have taken, and he is not mentioning them to his wife again, because he wants to spare her the grief. So we have these three stories that are running parallel in the second part, which are not imparted until the very end. And Andrew, you're absolutely right. That is not a coincidence. That is, yeah.
And if I could just add, it's ethically complicated, of course, that not saying to protect. You know, it's both an act of care, but it's also an act which raises ethical questions about. So it's so kind of ambiguous, powerfully ambiguous, I think, in ethical terms, and that you know, is one of the strengths of the novel.
Thank you. Yeah. Elizabeth?
Just to come back to the difference possible in Target and Hermann, and I was thinking of evocations of caves and such a marvelous presentation of Tilda. And I would say that there's a hangover there from impressions. Is with Target, it's often very cool and sharp and quick moving, noise amplified. The aesthetic effects are very different. But with Hermann, one of the fascinating things of these evocations of nature is the haze of memory as well, particularly if you contrast the first part of Daheim Blieben and the second part, where memory is coming in simultaneously with what's been seen now, felt now, and what's been remembered about what was. And it's absolutely fascinating, evocative writing.
Absolutely right. Yes, thank you.
I still come back to what I found. I did find it terribly intense combination of marvelous pleasure, aesthetic pleasure, and written particularly as well. But with my current day and on, constant sense of what was still to come and which Hermann just did not yet know. And this made me a very, very testing.
There is one particularly poignant section where he writes about the beauty of Berlin, and then he goes further, the beauty of Germany, and he goes the beauty of Munich and the area around Munich, and the beauty of Dachau, which has been painted by so many painters. And then the contrast, you know, he does know how to build it up, and then, you know.
I would just wonder, you know, yes, he didn't know the exact details, but I think he knew, like, I think people knew by 38 that they weren't better.
And it's just the horror of the bureaucratic, extraordinary settings of these atoms. Sorry.
Well, no, I mean, I think it's a very interesting question. I've been thinking about the fact that the novel ends with the boat tickets come too late. But, you know, the idea of everything coming too late, that's what's important, isn't it? Yeah, it's not the to get on the boat, it's the, you know.
Anyone else on Zoom? Would you like to ask a question?
This one, this one embarrassing. The only book in English called A Writer's Life.
Yes, please read it.
It's about the only thing for anybody who can't read, including the long grandson of my German business is lousy. My Australian's better. But he actually, I mean,
yeah.
Especially the only thing written, and it's not just about his life, it's about some stuff in the sort of
yeah.
I hope it's not.
Thank you. No, thank you for saying that. I completely agree. So, John Craig Sharple's A Writer's Life. Yes.
Yes, I wonder maybe that you talk about various correspondences to various family members. Who went where and how they kept to where they went.
Yeah.
Some family in the States, some family in
the eldest daughter came to England, and you probably, you know, asked George.
Yeah, I mean, February 1939, but Home Office has changed much. We were only given a 1 year visa and will be deported in February 1940. Fortunately, I would be here.
The getting back must have also been.
That's right. No, we were sent back several times. It's only because my father was a luminescence chemist. But also we were interned for just under a year on the Isle of Man, which I think is why at that time Georg Hermann writes to answer this other question. The issue of publishers
in London, I mean, at that time would have been very difficult.
Mm. Yeah.
And after that, with 2 small kids, I said, 5 years old, I was still going to school. That was because I was 4.
But also to answer, so the oldest daughter went to England, second daughter went to Denmark, youngest daughter went to Palestine. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Very late. I mean, the other 2, well, 14 May, last ship before they closed the ports when the Germans invaded. So they were quite lucky in that respect. But Georg Hermann could have come. He kind of felt, well, I'm awful in that concept. I think other people would ask what. And
there was also an opportunity for the youngest daughter, Ursula, to go out to Switzerland with her then husband, but she said, I'm only going with my father, and that didn't happen. So
no, I mean, for some reason, her first husband said, well, you can not your dad, God. But anyway, that's what's happened. So, and of course, the other thing is, she was in an exchange. She got out of Belsen. She got out of Belsen on an exchange because the Templars, who were Nazis sometimes, they were, the Germans said, there were 444 Templars at that time who wanted to go back to Germany. And the Nazis said, for every 1 Jew for 2 Templars, there were 2 Jews. There was a book written about it. And my art was so small. Georg Hermann could have joined because they had actually made contact. But he was, I think it was only a matter of hours.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I do think that is perhaps an appropriate note on which to end the lecture. Before we thank Godela again, there will be an opportunity to continue the discussion. Montague Lounge, just corridor, straight there. But let's thank Godela.